Long lines for scarce fuel, food shortages and power cuts. Sri Lanka is running out of dollars to buy essential goods. Will an international bailout save its economy? And is there a risk of defaulting on its debt? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. Sri Lanka is facing its worst economic crisis since independence in 1948. International ratings agencies are warning that it's on the verge of defaulting on its debt. Its usable foreign currency reserves have plunged below $1 billion, limiting Sri Lanka's ability to repay loans. And traders can't access dollars to buy imports. So, what does this all mean for Sri Lankans? Well, there's been a shortage of everything from fuel to food supplies. We'll get to our panel to discuss these issues in just a moment. But first, a report from Al Jazeera's Victoria Gatenby.
Soldiers at hundreds of petrol pumps. Sri Lanka's government has deployed troops after 3 elderly people died while queuing for hours to buy fuel in sweltering heat. Sri Lanka's foreign exchange reserves are dwindling rapidly and it's struggling to pay for food, fuel and medicines it buys from abroad. With its currency plunging in value, life's become difficult for many.
My income is down by half. When you look at the expenses, we're in debt.
The government says it's responding to complaints of stockpiling and poor distribution.
The need arose to get the military to supervise the distribution of fuel. The military has been deployed to help the public, not to curtail their human rights.
Opposition parties and citizen groups have been holding protests around the country, accusing the government of being responsible for the economic turmoil. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa last week asked for a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. He appealed to the nation to make temporary sacrifices.
By limiting the use of fuel and electricity as much as possible, the citizens too can extend their support to the country at this time. I hope that you'll understand the responsibility that lies with you at this challenging time.
The IMF says the government's foreign debt burden of $51 billion is unsustainable, and it has a $1 billion sovereign bond that's due in July. Many investors doubt Colombo will be able to repay without a painful restructuring. Victoria Gatenby for Inside Story.
Well, let's examine what's turned Sri Lanka's foreign debt burden into an unprecedented economic crisis. Its tourism sector, a major foreign exchange earner, was battered by the Easter attacks of 2019 and the coronavirus pandemic. And now 2 countries that are vital to its tourist market are at war. Russia and Ukraine had been the first and third largest source of visitors this year. A failed drive to become one of the world's first 100% organic farming nation also hurt food supplies. Sri Lanka was forced to import rice. The tea crop, the nation's top export, was devastated. Well, Sri Lanka wants China, a major lender, to restructure its debt, and it secured a $1 billion relief package from India. All right, so let's bring in our guests for today's discussion. From Colombo, we're joined by Nishan, Executive Director and Head of Research at Verité Research. From New Delhi, Jabin Jacob, Associate Professor at the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at Shiv Nadar University. And also in Colombo is Bhavani Fonseka, a Senior Researcher and Attorney at Law with the Centre for Policy Alternatives. A warm welcome to you all. Great to have you with us on Inside Story today. Nishan, let's start with you. How did Sri Lanka get into this mess? How far back do the problems go? Can the current situation be traced to a single event or events or time?
Thank you, Adrian. Great to be on the show. It's an important question because I think the causality of the current crisis is attributed in many ways. I personally think that there is a single point that can be attributed for the crisis, and it is the tax cuts that happened consequent to the presidential election in 2019. In fulfilling a promise of the presidential campaign manifesto Taxes were cut in a way that reduced government revenue by about 25% and reduced the tax base of the country by about 33%. And a few months later, that led to a critical ratings downgrade that effectively caused Sri Lanka to lose access to international financial markets. It was, as it were, the blacklisting downgrade. Now, after losing access to financial markets, as Sri Lanka kept repaying its debt, its reserves kept coming down. And as its reserves kept coming down, the ratings kept going down. And it was a downward slide, which Sri Lanka did not find a way to stem or stop. And the current situation is really the culmination of that process into virtually zero reserves. So I think if the rating downgrade had not happened, Sri Lanka would have continued the normal equilibrium of borrowing to repay its debt. And if the tax cuts hadn't happened, which then caused the revenue to fall so much that interest cost on revenue, government revenue, rose to 70%, which is perhaps the highest in the world. Lebanon had that in 2019 before it went into default. And so that explains really the rating downgrade in April 2020.
Nishan, what are the dangers then of Sri Lanka defaulting on its debt right now?
So I think, I use the word default to describe restructuring as well. But if I make a distinction between an orderly default, which comes through a negotiated process of restructure, and a disorderly default where you don't pay because you can't pay and you haven't negotiated an alternative and got the consent of your debt holders. I think the danger is of Sri Lanka getting into a disorderly default. It is, of course, very close to that process. And the only way to avoid a disorderly default now is to cause a great deal of pain to the local economy by withholding the dollars that come in through imports, exports, and other means from paying for essential supplies of gas, fuel, and medication. So I think Sri Lanka can avoid the disorderly default yet for a few more months, but only at great cost and pain to the local economy and people. But come July, when there is a $1 billion repayment due, I think that becomes a pivoting point. So Sri Lanka may need to engage quite quickly and proactively to start a negotiated process to restructure its debt before the July international sovereign bond payment of $1 billion becomes due.
Bhavani, I know that you agree with much of what we've just heard, but let's talk the politics of it. To what extent do you think Sri Lanka's problems are simply bad luck or down to economic management? We heard about those tax cuts and the problems that they've caused. I mean, what responsible government would do that, knowing that it's going to severely impact its ability to pay its way?
And thank you for having me and a timely discussion considering the situation in the country. You talk about the political context and the realities. We need to recognize that Sri Lanka is at a breaking point. People are on the streets protesting, essential goods are not available, there are queues in every corner. And now we've had 3 deaths of people who've stayed in line to get fuel. And this all comes back to the lack of political leadership in the present government. Now, we had the tax cuts in 2019, but we also had a lot of policies or lack of planning, U-turns in policies. For example, we'll, I guess, talk about the fertilizer ban that happened without really a plan in place to address what the hardships would be faced by the people. So it's really coming to a lack of plan by the political leadership. And contrast this to the political rhetoric in 2019 and 2020, when this government promised vistas of splendor and prosperity and promised a technocratic government in terms of stability, economic growth. All of that was promised to the electorate, and they got a majority in 2019 and 2020 at the elections. What has transpired after that is a complete opposite. And even now, when there's complete chaos actually in Sri Lanka, when we don't know when the power cuts would happen, we don't know if we would have petrol or diesel tomorrow because the queues are so long, there's still lack of information coming from this government. So really, it's a government that promised so much, but is unable to deliver and doesn't seem to be able to communicate.
So, Bhavani, to what extent does the Rajapaksa family have to shoulder at least some of the blame for this crisis? Is it wise to have major government portfolios spread among members of one political dynasty?
I mean, this is the big worry, is that we had the president being elected very soon. He appointed his brother, the prime minister. Now we have two other brothers in cabinet. We have several others in government, in cabinet, as well as other positions in government. And the question is, when you have such a lot of power centered in one family, and remember this, it's not just the family, but they have really concentrated power through constitutional means as well. So a constitutional amendment was passed called the 20th Amendment, which provided greater powers to the executive presidency. So we have the most powerful executive presidency in this country, in the history of Sri Lanka. And we also have family rule. So very limited checks and balances. But it's also one family that seems to be making the decisions, but leaving aside experts who should be consulted or should be part of that process. So a lot of issues, and I would say it's the government, but also it's the family that needs to be blamed for this chaos.
Jabin, we heard that that Sri Lanka has secured a $1 billion relief package from India. Is India going to ride to Sri Lanka's rescue?
Well, Sri Lanka is our neighbor. I don't think India has much of a choice in this matter. India will do what it can as best as it can. Sri Lanka has a very specific set of demands, requests from India. And I think India is already in the process of delivering much of this. I think there are some, shall we say, positive signs. I think it's just been announced that Indian tourism to Sri Lanka is picking up. It's already, in light of what the report just said about tourists from Russia and Ukraine no longer being able to travel, this presence of Indian tourists is, I think, going to be a big plus for the Sri Lankan economy. But I think also on other matters, Indian assistance to ongoing infrastructure projects, Indian credit lines, Indian loans, I think all of this, the Indian government will certainly be paying a great deal of attention to supporting Sri Lanka in whatever way it can.
Okay, I want to ask you another question, but it's related to something that I want, first of all, to put to Nishan. So I'll be back with you in just a moment, Jabin. Nishan, to what extent has Chinese debt played a huge role in Sri Lanka's current predicament? I remember at the time that Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka was first announced, there were dire warnings over the country becoming indebted to China. Have those warnings ultimately proven to be correct?
So thank you, Adrian. I think Chinese debt is not the largest quantum of foreign debt that Sri Lanka has to repay. And it also is not in the form of international sovereign bonds where capital payments come as bullet payments. So consisting of about 23% of foreign debt versus over 40% of the debt being with international sovereign bonds, I would say Chinese debt cannot be considered to be the crux of the problem. Okay, the Sri Lanka may have a separate problem that the money that they borrowed from China and other places, India included, were invested in projects that didn't have an adequate return, and that in general compounded its debt problem. But in many ways, it is the international sovereign bonds that have been borrowed without much concern for how well they have been invested either, that are turning out to be critical for Sri Lanka in terms of its debt sustainability at the moment.
Okay, thanks for that. Let me go back then to Jabin, because I just wanted to clear something up about China's role in Sri Lanka's economy, to establish what's in it for India. I think from what Nishan was saying, that it's not financial incentives here. We're talking more about perhaps geopolitical influence. India, of course, concerned about China's influence right throughout the region. To what extent is Sri Lanka's current crisis going to mean that it will become a pawn in regional politics in this battle for influence between India and China?
Well, first of all, I think we need to get a couple of things clear. Nishant is right in saying that the crux of the problem might not be Chinese loans per se, but I think there is a certain tendency to reckless economic policies, reckless political behavior that China encourages. And I think that really is a problem that not just Sri Lanka, but Pakistan, but a whole bunch of other countries around the world have faced as a result of Chinese assistance, Belt and Road Initiative projects, and so on. And India's sort of warning has always been on this front, that there's a lack of accountability, there's a lack of transparency, there's poor standards of environment, of labor management, and so on, that come with Chinese assistance, Chinese investments. So these are the two aspects that need to be very clear. Now, in terms of India's concerns from a geopolitical perspective, I think first and foremost, India is worried really about the state of economic affairs and the impact on the Sri Lankan people right now. And I think my two fellow panelists laid it out this quite well. Foreign reserves are depleted, there's hoarding, the Sri Lankan rupee has crashed. Economic instability is not good for India either in its neighborhood. Economic instability leads to political instability. And I think what one of my panelists said about the family, the Rajapaksa family controlling or taking a dominant role in politics, I think this is a matter of concern also from a political point of view. And this is precisely the sort of situation that that Chinese government ends up exploiting. And I think that really is a big concern. It's not just the economic aspect of it. It's just certain political behavior, a certain kind of politics that encouragement from China or support from China encourages. I think that really should be our concern.
Bhavani, Bhavani, I see you nodding there. What are the dangers then for Sri Lanka of becoming further indebted to India?
Well, I think there are lots of dangers at the present moment one needs to be looking at. But in a way, we are also at a very unprecedented novel time. So we'll have to see how things play out. But the recent negotiations and the opening of the line of credit raises a lot of questions as to what are the criteria, what was negotiated. So we haven't yet seen in the public domain what the criteria are and whether this is, actually there is a concern whether assets have been sold off, and there is already protests and concerns. And this is not a new thing. This has been there for a while in terms of any international negotiation line of credit. These concerns are going to be taken on board. There's also one dimension with the Indian angle that also needs to be addressed, that is the political solution. India has been a friend of Sri Lanka, has very much been supporting in the past in terms of a political solution, addressing the ethnic question. So would these issues also get raised in terms of the present conversations? We are yet to see. So I think India has a special place, has always had a special place, but we are in a very novel situation. So we have to see what was actually negotiated before we can comment on this.
Jabin, do you agree with that? I mean, what sort of influence can India bring to bear politically in Sri Lanka to ensure better economic management?
I think we've learned our lessons from too much political intervention in any of our neighbors. I think our primary concern at the moment is the economic situation in Sri Lanka. And frankly, the I think the Sri Lankans are quite able to manage politics of balancing India and China. I think they do this pretty well. They're pretty savvy at it. The problem really is a question of economic management and economic incompetence, and that's the solution that the Sri Lankans will have to find. It's not something that either the Chinese or the Indians or the IMF can help with by giving loans. I mean, it's a domestic issue. So there are limits to what India can do in Sri Lanka, and I agree. I mean, in terms of the lines of credit, in terms of assets management, there certainly should be transparency, and Sri Lanka is right to ask for transparency on these, whether it is from India or from China. But it cannot be selective. It has to be from everyone.
Okay, Nishan, Jabin touched upon it there. The lender of last resort.
Maybe I'd like to come in on this.
Yeah.
I think that there's a very important role for the IMF to play. But in coming to that, let me just discuss the India and China dynamic a little bit. I think, it is difficult to suspend the view that there hasn't been some element of bilateral opportunism exercised by both China and India in Sri Lanka's time of difficulty. China was able to negotiate sweeping concessions and tax holidays of unprecedented proportion and regulatory suspensions for the port city that it has built in Colombo, Sri Lanka. India was able to, in extremely short time, manage to get Sri Lanka to lease out, quite a valuable asset in terms of oil tanks in the Trincomalee port. And both of these transactions really happened as Sri Lanka's difficulties started to emerge, and there was hope that either China or India would help bail Sri Lanka out of the difficulty it was facing with regard to its debt. Now, we must understand that India could also publish these transactions that we say are opaque, where the credit lines from India, and we've been talking about why they are non-transparent, and Sri Lankans are very worried. I don't think it should be only up to the Sri Lankan government to be transparent about these transactions. India could also, I think, proactively be transparent and show good faith in what's being done. So I think we may need to keep in mind, not that we are sort of certainly not critiquing any country. We understand that countries act in self-interest, but it would probably be important to understand that there's an element of that is going on at the same time as Sri Lanka being assisted. So let me come to the IMF.
Yeah, very, very, very quickly, because we're running out of time.
Okay, so maybe we come back. I think that, when India initially gave credit to Sri Lanka and said, look, if you want us to roll over this credit, we'd like you to get into a program with the IMF. It was tying assistance to improvement in behavior.
Okay.
But what we see now is that India is offering credit lines in opaque sort of forms without tying it to good behavior. And I think that's something that India can revise in the way it approaches Sri Lanka.
Okay, Bhavani, I've got about 30 seconds left. I'm sorry, but is there any sort of light at the end of the tunnel for the people of Sri Lanka at the moment, with all of the hardships that they're currently enduring?
Well, Adrian, I can say one thing. Sri Lanka, we have a very resilient community. We've gone through decades of war, tsunami, and many other challenges. So I think that there's some hope that we can get through this. But we need political leadership, we need a plan, we need communication. But also, I think just at this very fundamental point is that people just need to know what's going to happen tomorrow and the next week. It's just complete darkness. And I'm actually saying that because we do have just complete blackout. So we need some sort of information and plan. But I think people will come together, but we need a leadership as well.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm sorry to cut you short, but we are out of time, unfortunately. Many thanks to you all, Nishan Damel, Jabin Jacob, and Bhavani Fonseka, for being on the programme today. As always, thank you for watching. Don't forget, you can see this programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter, our handle at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the whole team here in Doha, thanks for watching. I'll see you again. Bye for now.